moderating this panel today. So we are, I'm going to try to not say at all. This is the first and second concurrent session in an ongoing speaker series hosted by New York City DSA and our local Afro-Socialists and Socialist Color Caucus about the political revolution and where we go from here. So for many of us in DSA, the best thing to come out of the Sanders campaign was a new convergence of unions and movement groups, a coalition that included both the Dream Defenders, National Nurses United, Ethiopian packinghouse workers, tenant organizers from Kansas City, the Sunrise Movement, and so many more. So we want to build on this with this, the speaker series, which is taking place over the next few weekends. We want to build on this convergence by making it more formal and durable for the long haul and more capable of being retooled for non-electoral organizing work. So we want to have a conversation today about the big strategic questions about, where we go from here. And in this discussion, we're talking about canceling rent, the housing justice movement, as just sort of one part of this broader political moment that we find ourselves in. Before we get started, I want to say that we were going to be joined today by Joanza and Paulette from Vocal, who were unable to make it because we recently lost one of their coworkers who's been a real hero in the housing movement in New York, Elizabeth Owens. So they're doing a memorial service for her today, but we're still thinking of them and we wish they were here with us. And it's really incredible that, Bernie Sanders was the only presidential candidate in recent memory to actually talk about homelessness and the lack of housing for folks at the national scale. So we honor their work even though they couldn't join us. So before I get into the specifics of this panel, I want to encourage everyone watching to check out the Facebook event and the Eventbrite registration so that you can be informed about the other panels that are taking place over the next few weekends and conversations. And if you put your contact information into the Eventbrite there, you'll be able to receive more information and updates about what's coming up. Okay, so today we're going to discuss the housing movement and the movement to cancel rent. Housing has really been in free fall across the country right now, but it is, even though millions of people are waking up to the fact that no one can afford the rent right now, we know that it's been a real crisis for a very long time. And it's only been recently with the elevation of federal demands for national rent control or an expansion of social housing that there's been a comprehensive movement response to the crisis. So we are I'm very proud to be joined today by some of the leaders of that work. So we have with us today Alona from Movement School, Tiana and Tara from KC Tenant and the Federal Homes Guarantee Campaign, and Rima, the founder of the Bangladeshi Tenants Union. And as this conversation unfolds, please do post your thoughts and your questions in the chat. We'll get back to those questions later on. And now I'm just going to get started. So the format's going to be that I ask questions. If you want to answer, just jump in and go for it. We'll have an informal conversation amongst all of us, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So let's just start by asking everybody to tell us a little bit about your work over the last few years and how it related to the Bernie campaign. Tiana, you want to start? You're on mute, I think.
There we go. Hi. We started late 2018. It's only been a couple of years. Here in Kansas City, there is a pretty disgusting racial climate, and the background is egregious, if nothing else. And so we needed to change the climate of the housing insecurities in Kansas City. There were laws written, all of them benefited landlords, none of them benefited tenants. Laws that were on the books that should have maybe benefited tenants were not being enforced. It was just total chaos. We knew that something needed to be done, and so we started our Tenant Bill of Rights campaign, which we did win. Within our first year, it was shocking, but a really good victory. but we're still fighting here, still fighting for implementation, for enforcement and things like that, because you win something and you think that that's it, but that's not where it stops, right? Um, it's a process, and we're trusting the process. We are coming together now, putting together campaigns for the climate of what's going on now. All these things relate to Bernie's campaign because Bernie has always been for the people. He's always believed that we are not okay until all of us are okay. And housing is a foundation, right? People need that to survive. They need shelter. And when you move from a place of instability to survival mode, and there's no resources, then you move on to devastation and desperation. And in desperation, that is where crime and violence and all these other acts that we see come from. So it's all deeply connected, and I believe Bernie's campaign deeply reflects that as well. So it's a foundation, the housing, it's all connected from there. We've got to keep people from getting from that point of survival mode to desperation.
Cool. Tara, what do you want to add to the work of Casey Tenants and the Homes Guarantee campaign?
Well, Tiana's being really humble. So first I want to say a little bit more about her. Tiana's one of the founders of Casey Tenants. She and I met late 2018, and she was at our very first meeting on February 17th, 2019, and we started organizing and really quickly built a ton of people power in Kansas City, where there's not a huge culture of community organizing. So Tiana is part of this movement in our city that's really shaken up politics as it was known before. And Tiana, just to toot your horn a little bit more, when she started organizing with us, she was actually experiencing homelessness, right, for about 6 months when we were building Casey Tenants. And now, after about a year and a half of organizing, Tiana is not only known around town as the political force that she is, but she's also become one of the foremost leaders in the country on this issue. And speaking of the Bernie campaign, you can see Tiana all over it because she helped to write the Homes Guarantee. She's been a spokesperson on this issue. She's engaged with Bernie and Bernie World people on a Homes Guarantee over the last year and a half. So just to say a little bit more about that, Tiana basically said, what we need to say about Casey Tenants, we're a badass group of tenants in Kansas City organizing across race and class lines, and we have built a lot of power. We won a Tenants Bill of Rights last year, as she said, and we're consistently taking on some of the worst corporate slumlords here. We have shut down eviction court in the last couple of months. We've had evictions here, unfortunately, for the last 3 months, so we are in kind of a state of acute crisis, and we are having to escalate our tactics accordingly. And then I guess I'll just add by way of introduction, I'm also associated with the Homes Guarantee campaign, as Sia said, and it's a campaign that is led by tenants like Tiana, many of the folks involved with Movement School, many of the folks involved for Housing Justice for All in New York, part of writing this visionary agenda for the world that we deserve. And the premise is very simple. We live in the richest country in the history of the world. We can and we must guarantee that everyone has a home, period, full stop. And Bernie, I think, did an amazing job of really centering this in his campaign. Almost exactly a year ago, he launched his housing agenda, which basically was the Homes Guarantee. And he was consulting with movement leaders in constructing that platform. And that's notable, I think, because it's a huge deal that he committed to such a visionary agenda. It's also notable because housing had literally never been part of federal presidential conversations until Bernie made it part of those conversations, right? 2016, no one had a housing platform. At most, people were talking about like the low-income housing tax credit, right? And in this year's election cycle, we were having conversations about social housing and about universal rent control and all of these things that had never been part of our conversation before. So I think we owe Bernie a huge credit, and I think he would say he owes people like Tiana a huge credit because that agenda came from folks like her.
Cool. Rima, you want to tell us about your work and what you do and how it related to the Bernie campaign?
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, and I'm like so inspired just hearing about all the work that's going on around this country. I think that's one of the spirit of Bernie Sanders, right? Is this ability to kind of motivate people into doing something bigger than themselves, right? The not me, us kind of message that really caught all of us. So my name is Rima. I'm the founder of the Bangladeshi Tenant Union, which was founded last year in 2019. New York City, has a huge housing crisis going on even before COVID. But my work with housing, I want to say, started when I was like 8 years old. Going with my mom to NYCHA management. So I grew up in public housing, and translating for my mom at a young age for repairs, for heat issues, for paint that's falling off. And so I want to say that I've been an advocate and an organizer since then, which has really come true in my life now. So now I work with Bangladeshi tenants out in Jamaica, Queens. A lot of these folks are working class people. And a lot of things that, Bangladeshi folks oftentimes talk or feel is that, we live in this land, but we don't necessarily have ownership or the right to even ask for anything. And so that kind of started off our conversation of, why are we not invited to the table to talk about housing? Why are we not asked, what type of housing is qualified for us, right? What kind of dignified living do we deserve? And oftentimes our Bangladeshi folks, they come from a country that's still developing, and a country where a lot of our resources are stolen from, right? And that's how countries like America kind of thrive. And I think Bernie hits on this all the time, right? That we are not the best country in the world. But what happens often with Bangladeshis is that we compare our living culture back home to here. And so we equate that as being, oh, but it's better, right? We're not living in our village. We're not living in a hut. We have running water, even though that running water is brown, it's dirty, it's not healthy, there's lead. So a lot of my conversation with my folks is to undo that, right? To undo that thinking that you are deserving of quality housing. And this is what quality housing looks like. And that in order to get that, that requires organizing. And you have the ability to take ownership of that, right? And I think Sia's seen us, more so on the ground. We don't come out often, but when we do, we come out with a splash. And so one of the big splashes that we did was, we did a video with Bernie Sanders on tenant organizing. And I think one that put their landlord on the map, which they were so thrilled about because they hate their landlord. And, they thought like, wow, a presidential candidate, one knows that I'm Bangladeshi, even a president to an American president to even utter those words, right? To even acknowledge that there are Bangladeshi Americans that live in this land was big for them. And then to even take focus on their small little tenant union, we just formed, I think it was a month in. And, we went through the whole platform. We translated the whole platform because we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just us understanding it because we have the ability and we're learning the skills to organize, but that everyone everywhere can understand that this is a platform for everyone. And so, through kind of that jumpstart, I want to say he gave us an amazing jumpstart. We've been able to have so many conversations that I don't think I would have thought we would get to, right? And today, 25 of them are participating in a rent strike, since March. And that's very hard. It's the first time I'm doing a rent strike, so I'm hella scared. But they trust this process and the process of organizing that really, again, going back to the spirit of what Bernie Sanders stood for, right? The spirit of being able to organize with your neighbors, that really, really lives within them. I want to say every single day, and they surprise me every day. So yeah, that's a little bit about, my work. I'm looking forward to some of these questions.
Yeah, it's awesome. And if you haven't seen the video of the Bangladeshi Tenants Union Bernie Sanders put out, y'all should watch it. It's very inspiring. Alona, can you tell us about your work and how it related to the Bernie campaign and maybe other campaigns too?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's always such an honor to be in company with such amazing movement leaders across the country. So just super inspired by all of the work that y'all have been doing, and it's an honor to be here with all of you. And yeah, after Bernie won, there was so much amazing work that came out of that campaign, right? But we got finally inspired and empowered to act, but we also came to the realization, like, wow, we have a lot of work that we have to do, and that also inspired, a whole new generation of elected officials that look like us to run. One of those people was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who ran in 2018, and I had the honor of being part of that campaign, and we learned so much, not having any institutional support, not taking corporate PAC money, not having any sort of real financial backing, and just having to rely on the power of people, which we believed was the most powerful tool that you can ever have. But after that, we learned so much. We learned so many lessons. We learned how to create new systems on how to run true grassroots campaigns. And we wanted to make sure to institutionalize that knowledge and really give it back to the community so that campaigns can become more representative of their communities, and that grassroots candidates can run anywhere in the country and feel supported, that they can win in this political system. So right after winning the primary for AOC, we created Movement School, which trains people how to run grassroots campaigns. And fast forward to now, we've trained tons of organizers who have gone on to work on numerous campaigns and have won, from Cori Bush to Cara Eastman to Jamal Bowman, to Jessica Cisneros, Marie Newman, and more. And in New York City, we did a lot of work specifically with public housing tenants and the housing movement. And it really stemmed from our organizing for the Green New Deal. And, the Green New Deal is this framework made to be interpreted by the communities that we're looking to organize and represent through the Green New Deal. So for us here in New York City, knowing that there is a crisis, quite literally, in public housing, where, especially here in New York City, where 1 in 15 New York City is literally 1 in 15 public housing tenants, and also the immense political capital that public housing tenants have. They really are a sleeping giant, as I said, and we really set out to educate public housing tenants on their rights, make sure that they know that these living conditions that they're living in are not right, and that not only are they not right, it is a violation of their right as a tenant in public housing. And through that process, we got to work with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's office to create the Green New Deal for public housing, a legislation that was created right alongside public housing tenants with their input every step of the way, and it was created into actual legislation that we launched. Actually, it's about to be a year in November, alongside Senator Bernie Sanders in DC, and it's been a crazy journey ever since. And I've gotten to work with some of you on this call, and it's been amazing. And I feel like all of these moments, especially past Bernie, and all of our work is finally coming to the point where we are going to really come together and win, and it's been really exciting to be part of. So thank you.
Thank you. So the next question that I have for folks, just to lay out a little bit of the problem. So while public and social housing has been in total free fall across the country, rent is unaffordable in every state and every city. The housing movement has typically fought for things very locally, either confronting individual landlords or building local tenant associations, maybe around zoning or land use, or even fighting for legislation at the local and municipal level. And we're all, of course, doing that, as y'all just described. But something that's happened recently is that the Bernie campaign call for national rent control and an end to homelessness and an expansion of social housing really did take a big leap forward in the direction of defining housing as a major feature of federal politics. And I don't know what's going to happen in the, I think what's interesting here too is like housing, or a lack of housing, has always been in federal politics, but maybe we don't name it. Like Trump is, after all, a New York City landlord, and so we do have this housing politics, or an absence of housing politics, as like a bad feature of the federal government, of course. But now that housing has become a real national issue, and there's a growing recognition that there's a rental housing crisis in every corner of the country, what is it going to take? The Bernie campaign is over. Should we keep fighting for our demands at the national level? And if so, what's it going to take to keep our national movement moving forward?
I can jump in. I mean, I think, we've been scheming. I've been on the phone with Ilona a lot recently and with tenants across the country about what it's going to take to cancel rents. I think, we introduced this piece of legislation with Representative Omar in April to cancel rents and mortgage payments. And we got, 35, 40 co-sponsors. And then we were taken to school by Nancy Pelosi and establishment Democrats who rallied around a rental assistance proposal, which, by the way, they told us was winnable, and they have not won. And I think that represents a huge disjuncture between what the people told us they wanted, right? Tenants were clear that liberation was not coming in the form of an eviction moratorium or some voucher or subsidy. Tenants were clear starting in March that what they needed was their rent fully canceled, right? So we wrote this piece of legislation, but there's this huge disjuncture between what the people want and what the people in DC want. And the people in DC rallied around this other proposal, which is not only not politically viable because they don't have people power behind it, it's also not at all in line with what people actually want and need. So when I think about what we need to do right now, I mean, there was already a housing crisis that was very deep in places like Kansas City and New York and across the country, predating the Bernie campaign, during the Bernie campaign, predating COVID, and now it has risen to a level of catastrophe that we have to do something about above and beyond our wildest dreams from last year, right? Last September when Bernie was introducing his housing platform, none of us had any clue that this was coming at us. And as conditions have shifted, our organizing strategy has to shift, right? And regardless of who wins in November, our organizing strategy has to shift because Joe Biden's not talking about canceling the rent, right? Joe Biden's not talking about a homes guarantee. I think there's everyone has their opinions about what to do about voting in November and whatnot. So I'm not going to get into that. But the reality is, regardless of the outcomes of the election, we need to be ready to shut shit down in a way that's bigger and bolder than ever before. And Sia and I, we had these conversations a couple months ago that were in one way, you can think about what's going on right now as the biggest rent strike in history, because so many people are literally unable to pay their rent. But we all know, because we're tenant organizers, there's a difference between kind of unorganized mass non-payment that's not necessarily politicized, and then what's possible through an actual rent strike, like the rent strike that Rima's in, that is politicized and it's organized and it's coordinated. And the way I see it, we're not going to win cancel rent, we're not going to win a homes guarantee until we politicize the crisis and we leverage that economic and social disruption to force the things that we know we need. So I think in January, what's our collective plan to go shut some shit down together until we win cancel rent, until we're on a path to a homes guarantee and a Green New Deal for public housing and all the stuff that we need.
Yeah. Anyone want to jump in?
I 100% agree with a lot of what you said, and just want to add that there is a narrative around housing that's so individualistic that the reason why you're in the shelter system, the reason why you're in public housing is because you yourself, right, just can't do it, or it's always, and that really speaks to the history of this country, right, and how we've used these narratives around brown and black folks, and so unless we are doing housing work with intersectional work, we're not going to get there, right? Because unless we have a conversation about who stole land, right, who worked this land, and that means changing narratives around your own dinner table. That means changing narratives around your workspace, right? In every space that you're in, making sure that you're plugging it in. unless we're doing, and that's the nonprofit industrial complex, right? That they want us to work on these issues kind of like separately. Like you do housing, you get funding for housing. Don't talk to the people that are doing racial justice, right? Don't talk to the people that are doing climate justice. But ultimately, all these things are like intertwined, right? And so we, I don't know what it is that we need to do ultimately, but there needs to be a conversation shift in just talking about these issues solely as like one thing, right? And going back to the point where it's like we've gotten far, right? And we've organized in manners where I never thought I would be organizing a rent strike. I never thought COVID would happen, you know. But that just means we have to like shift and change, and even just, you know, the verdict that came out with Breonna Taylor, like all of that needs to be intertwined, right? All of those things, because even, you know, her sleeping in her bed in a home, right, was not safe. And all of those things kind of intersect, and unless we're having all of those conversations, like it's going to be tough, right? Because people are just going to be like, well, I don't want to just talk about housing. This issue resonates more with me. But ultimately, we need to tell people that all of these issues need to resonate with you, right? Because all of these issues affect all of us. It's not just, you know, housing. Housing can be a start of it, but even if we say like, oh, everybody needs housing, housing is a human right, so is water, right? And water is linked to climate justice. Are we talking about that? You know, and so we have to figure out, and I don't know how, but we have to figure out a way to really like intertwine these conversations, because I feel like we're still continuing to have these conversations in silo, not because we want to, but I think we're just so programmed into thinking that like housing is my thing, and like this is the thing that I'm passionate about. This is the thing that's gonna get me up in the morning to go, and just like really doing not only just undoing some of that work internally, but like also within our community, that like you have to pick just one issue that you need to rally against, right? And that's really what we saw in city council when we passed the budget, which everybody was like, budget's going to get slashed, let's save our own program, right? Let's talk to city council how this housing program is more valuable than that housing program. And we need to make sure that we are keeping an eye on folks who do that, especially in local politics, right? State and assembly politics. We need to pay attention to folks who behave in that way. And we, you know, need to call them out for it. We need to, you know, organize against that, because we shouldn't have to choose between somebody getting housing or healthcare. Like that, to even ask that question at this point is just, you know, ridiculous. But unfortunately, we're in that kind of state, at least in New York City, right? Where, you know, people are literally fighting over whose budget is going to get slashed more. I know it's an unfortunate thing to see, but it's things that happen in every city.
Yeah. I definitely echo what Rima said, and Tara also, and especially because, you know, I think that definitely this time around, housing is beginning to make its way into the national discourse finally. And I think, you know, it's for many different reasons. One of it being, you know, that we are in a pandemic, so we're seeing how the housing crisis is gravely affecting this country, period. So people are starting to, you know, our electeds are starting to pay more attention to it, right? But at the same time, I also think about, like, you know, Tara was right about we have to really reimagine what organizing looks like under a Biden presidency, under a Trump presidency, still in the middle of a pandemic. And one of the things that definitely constantly come up, especially when, you know, organizing with public housing tenants, is the fear of going on rent strike, the fear of not paying their rent, even though they're literally making the life, you know, the gut-wrenching decision of deciding whether to feed their children or pay their rent. But they're just so, you know, I feel to an extent, you know, working class people in this country are so conditioned to be casualties to the system that we don't even fight. When in reality, it's right there in black and white that these are our rights. And so something I constantly remind, you know, public housing tenants, especially here in New York City, and especially to make it part of the political discourse, is NYCHA has over 500,000 people that live in it. They can control who the governor is. They can elect the next mayor. They can sway any election down ballot, up ballot in New York State. Period. And they need to know that, because we forget how much power we actually do have collectively, right? And it's what I tell the tenants, like, 10 of you go on rent strike, you know, I can see why there's a fear of retaliation there. But if 100 or your entire building goes on rent strike, it's really hard to knock you guys for that. And we have to constantly be reminding, you know, tenants and each other too, because this work can be incredibly exhausting physically, mentally, emotionally, right? That we truly have all the power, but we have to come together. And like Rima said, we have to find those intersections, because especially when it comes to housing, you know, a lot of people see housing as an after fact thing. And I see it as a foundational, a foundational right to at least give someone a fighting chance at success at living in this world. You know, people think like, oh, you know, let's focus on the economy, and that way people will be okay. Let's focus on, you know, everything else basically besides like the one fundamental right that would literally give, like I said, people a fighting chance at success. And we are letting people down at that foundational human right that we need to give people in order for them to survive. So, you know, hopefully, right, with all the work that we are doing collectively together and finding those intersections, right, knowing that housing isn't just housing, it intersects with climate, it intersects with the economy, it intersects with racial justice, you know, it intersects with the labor movement. You know, finding those intersections, I think we can really you know, move this issue forward, especially right now, in such a critical time, you know, that we're facing right now.
Hi. I think that we've got to take matters into our own hands, right? It's time for action. People have been talking. It's not getting any better. It seems that we are not being heard. And we need things that invoke immediate responses, immediate action, right? We did an eviction blockade, right? Where we did a piece of protest where we stood up in court and stated that evictions are violent. Just continuing over, we did manage to stop evictions that day, right? So we need things that invoke that immediate reaction, that get that attention, that politicizes this crisis, so that we can get things done. Incrementalism is dead, right? People are dying in the streets. We are way past words. It's time for action.
Thank you. So I think you touched on this all already, but I just want to shout out, you know, that more people are taking social action right now, protesting right now between rent strikes, but also more people are protesting right now than ever before in U.S. history as part of this recent uprising for Black lives. And we all know, of course, that police protect private property and evictions are just one more form of state violence. How do you see the cancel rent movement and the movement to fight evictions working with the movement against police brutality and for Black lives in this moment?
Hey, I'll take a first stab at that. Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that these systems are completely interconnected, right? I think Rima spoke to this brilliantly before when talking about how we can't pretend like the tenants in our bases, in our tenants unions, are not also, you know, Black and brown people who are being brutalized by the state and the carceral state. And so we at KC Tenant started to have conversations about this in late May and early June after police murdered George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade. And one quote that I'll never forget is, you know, we took a look at the Kansas City budget to kind of compare the way that the city prioritizes policing versus tenant rights. And what we found was $273 million are going to our police, which is, over, I think it's around half of our general fund for the city this year. And meanwhile, we had to scrape and claw for $300,000 to enforce our tenants' bill of rights that we passed last year, right? So for every $433 that the city is spending on the police force, they're spending $1 on tenants. And of course, tenants are half the city. And a quote that I won't ever forget from that first conversation that we had after all of those police murders was from our leader, Janae Manley, who said, "It's very clear that this city would rather house us in their jails." And I think that speaks exactly to that intersection. And the way that we've kind of like lived into that work with KC Tenants is that we are, at every step along the way, like organizing in an anti-racist way and centering the leadership of our amazing Black leaders like Tiana, like Janae, and like so many more. And, we've shown up at protests all summer. KC Tenants has been like part of the voices in the streets that are demanding defunding and abolition of the police and investing in our communities through housing and other things. And then right now, I don't want to spill too many beans about this, but we're cooking up an amazing campaign that Tiana can tell you more about, which is going to be run as an Invest Divest campaign to invest in a housing trust fund and social housing and cooperative housing and community land trust and take the money from the pigs. The city is facing huge revenue losses right now. The mayor's on Twitter saying, we're going to have to cut $60 million somewhere. Every department's going to have to cut money. What we know is that the police department could cut 22% of its budget, and we would not have to cut from any other department, and it would still be the best funded department of any in Kansas City. So we're definitely applying like all of our lessons from this summer to every aspect of how we do our organizing moving forward.
I'll go ahead and add to that. The housing crisis is a Black Lives Matter issue, right? It directly affects people who are Black and brown disproportionately. The housing numbers don't lie, right? But the housing, racial injustice has been a part of housing since the beginning of time, right? From redlining to all the other ways that they kept us out of being able to own or be in housing or be housing stable. So this is not new, and they are not aware of this. I sit on the Health Commission, and when they take housing from, we have a 1 to 10 system, take housing from a 3 to 10 right now in an emergency, and say that it's that important, then they know what's going on. It's all political, and that's why we have to also politicize this crisis to make sure that the right narrative is being put out there.
And I'll just add that there are some Bangladeshi people that are hella racist, and having those conversations are really tough, but necessary for folks who call themselves allies, right? Even if you are uncomfortable, nobody cares because there are literally people dying. And so your uncomfort is okay momentarily to save somebody, right? Their lives. And so, when there was, a ton of protests happening, a lot of our folks, were getting information from mainstream media. And the images that they were getting from mainstream media, right? Of riots and things being burned down and property, and it was kind of woven into this American dream, right? Of what if I'm not, self-made billionaire? What if that was my home? What if, intertwined with the welfare queen, right? That Black men are criminals, right? All of those things kind of intertwined. It was a very difficult conversation for me to have, I'll be honest, and even a very difficult conversation for me to have in language, because a lot of those terms, and I grew up mostly here, and so a lot of those terms were not ever translated for me. I didn't know what a lot of those terms meant, or even how to explain, why these kind of, narratives exist and how they're linked to the history of this country. And like, unless you look at the history of this country, you won't understand that these are things that are perpetuated over and over again. And you can see that clearly in New York City, where all you see the headlines, right, that are sensationalized is somebody died, somebody got shot, somebody this, right? And what they're trying to do is take your eye off of the prize, which is that we, one, need to tax the rich. Two, there are people that are hungry, you know. It may not be 1920, but people are still hungry to this day, and we're hungry even before COVID. And we are not addressing those issues. But instead, what they're doing is building on this narrative that, oh, it's one group of folks, or it's a particular group of folks that are perpetuating these things, right? And again, like, those conversations are not meant to have in like a one-time shot thing. I feel like I'm going to have those conversations for the rest of my life, you know, forever. And that's okay. That's a part of me being an ally, right? To undo some of the things that we've learned, even to this day, I'm still undoing some of the things that I learned, right? Because it's thrown at me whether I like it or not, in every single way possible, from the food I eat, from where I shop, from the subway I take, from the place I work at, right? The place where I got my education from. All those things are you know, kind of already formulated for you, right? All the images and the media stuff that you get, whether it's on Facebook, social media, all those things are kind of intertwined in a lot of these narratives that are anti-Black, right? And it takes active consciousness to undo, right? That, oh, that's an anti-Black remark, right? Or that's this narrative, right? Being perpetuated in a different way, layered in a different thing. I won't say that my folks are there. I'm going to be honest, right? And that's because a lot of folks haven't engaged them in this kind of conversation. A lot of their own kids don't have the vocabulary to engage them in this conversation, even though they know that what their parents are saying is wrong or what their aunt is saying is wrong. They just don't know how to kind of break that threshold, to break that line. But I think what's happening with the younger generation of folks, they're definitely participating in this cancel culture, but we know that you can't just toss out your mom, you can't just toss out your uncle, right? These are kind of support systems and relationships that are needed. And as a social worker, a lot of people don't know, but I'm a social worker, you know, having social supports are so important to your ability to thrive, right? Emotionally and mentally. And so we are beginning to have those conversations. And even, you know, through my work with the Bangladeshi Americans for Political Progress, that's where we're starting to have those conversations, right? We're starting to put forward progressive platforms, and we're saying that, you know, being Bangladeshi and being racist is not okay, right? And you have to be actively anti-racist. It is not okay to just be like, you know, I'm going to post this Black Lives Matter thing on my Instagram and I'm going to look cool and I'm going to look hip, but you have to be actively doing that work as an ally every single day, every chance you get. So I won't say much more. I feel like I can talk about this forever, but maybe we can go to the next question.
Thank you. So I think sort of building on that and building on this, like, this narrative and these like narratives that perpetuate themselves. There is, like, even if people think that evictions are bad during a pandemic, there is still this like bad tenant narrative that says that evictions are somehow just and should happen. But right now, we've been able to win eviction moratoriums at the municipal, state, and even the federal level. So what does that moratorium mean politically, and how can we maintain it and build upon it and maintain this idea that evictions are unjust, not just during a pandemic, but always?
I can take a stab at that. I think when I think of about eviction moratorium and then the aftermath, which is like the debt that people are going to be forced into, right? I feel like America is the perfect spot for that, right? Because we're all about debt. We're all about keeping people in debt. And that means we'll be enslaved to our debt forever, right? And so even some folks like Trump, who I would be like, you know, I thought you'd fight to not have an eviction moratorium or something like that. Understand the value of having people in debt for longer, right? And so of course they're going to support certain things like that, but like not support canceling rent, right? Even the CBC thing that came out, directive that came out, right, says that eviction moratorium is okay. You know, you can prove all these things and you can say all these things, but don't forget you owe this money, right? And so because we live in this kind of like debt society, right, whether it's through owning a car, even renting an apartment, you have to show that you can borrow money, right? Doesn't matter if you have the money. Student debt, credit card debt, mortgage debt. I mean, there's so many. So I don't think it was hard for our government to kind of pass this thing. You know, if anything, it gave them the idea that these folks, right, working class people, are just going to be stuck where they're at for much longer, which is much better for us, right? Because they're going to be so busy paying off their debt that they're not going to pay attention to who's actually earning more wealth, right? They're not going to pay attention to Jeff Bezos not paying a cent in taxes, or Amazon is Jeff Bezos. I meant Netflix not paying anything in taxes, right? So I feel like it was a comfort thing for them. I don't think it was necessarily a bold thing for them. Because again, the bold thing is to wipe people of their debt, right? To say that you are free of this kind of anxiety, this paranoia, this kind of thing that says, oh, it's going to take me 30 years to pay off this mortgage, right? This thing that you are trapped in. And so I feel like it was just a comfort move for them. It wasn't necessarily a bold move for them. Although we appreciate it, right? Because it gives us more opportunities to organize. It gives us time to organize for the cancel rent. So I think that's where it benefits us, but I don't think that they necessarily did it to benefit any of us, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there is a lot of work that we can be doing with people right now to politicize their experience. Again, shouting out Rima for making a really great point earlier around how housing is treated in this country as such an individual issue. And so many more people are in crisis right now than were before COVID. And what we know from organizing tenants for the last several years is that people buy into the dominant narratives about who's at fault when you're about to face eviction, right? And a lot of people think that they're at fault. And what we have to do as organizers is go meet people where they're at and introduce people, if they're not already introduced, to like the systemic violence that is inherent in evictions, whether now or otherwise, and racial capitalism that led to this circumstance, right? I mean, again, I'll let Tiana tell this story on her own, but I feel like in organizing with KC Tenants, every time I have a one-on-one with Tiana, she gets more and more clear on like the systems that created the conditions that her family has been forced into, right? And that politicization is something that then she takes into Gabriel Tower Apartments when we're organizing a tenants union. And so I think that's a big piece of it, is like politicizing people around their inability to pay, politicizing their debt. Shout out to the Debt Collective. They just put out this really brilliant book, I think, on Haymarket that is free for everyone. And it's about like this experience of like politicizing our debt and how we can disobey the American idea that we have to carry that debt with us everywhere, and all of these layers and layers and layers of debt that people are forced into. But I do think like the more fundamental thing, and the question that you're asking, Sia, is like, how do we transform people's idea about what housing is? And as long as housing is considered something that's a pure commodity, and as long as our imagination is so limited to thinking that housing is a commodity, then broadly speaking, the public will never understand why debts should be erased, rents should be canceled, homes should be guaranteed, right? So we have this like ultimate kind of soul level project that we have to do of convincing people that housing should be guaranteed as a human right and as a public good. And that's like a massive intervention in American dominant narratives that overwhelms me quite a bit, to be honest with you. But then when I'm in conversation with folks like you all, it feels a little bit more doable, because I know there's such deep alignment among this group. And ultimately, moments like this, as painful as they are also opportunities for politicization and for organizing around that vision for a different world, because it's so clear that this world is failing us, right? Like this moment that we're in is a story of market failure, period. The market doesn't work to deliver housing, period, right? So like, what other option is there? This is a moment to inject that imagination into our organizing culture and into the public. And I hope that we will be successful in that, right? I have some optimism that this group of people, plus all of our comrades, like, will be able to translate this crisis into the awakening of our imagination that we need.
You're on mute, Tiana. Tiana, I think you're on mute. I can't get you off. You gotta get yourself off mute. No, still mute. There you go.
Okay. I think it's got to be personalized, right? Those stories are so personal. And for me, like, I always use something personal. Like, I just came from a funeral. There was a death in my family, and it became so clear to me how these systems are put in place. And the poor and working class people turn on each other and hurt and destroy each other while the people who create these conditions go unscathed. It is in every aspect of human life, and we live with this every day, right? The problem is that there's a disconnect. They cannot see. They have not sat in a freezing car where they're sleeping at with a starving baby whose hunger cry will not be quieted by anything but something to eat. And even if the baby does get to the point where they can close their eyes and go to sleep, that hunger cry will be even more fierce when that baby awakes. They do not connect to the desperation that comes with things like that. Evictions are violent. I don't care if you did do something, destroyed some property. There's no other property that you can damage and not be able to own again or be delayed in those experiences. There is, and this is a human right. There is no other instance where you might have to pay for it, right? Go after them. But to keep them from housing, from shelter, from that stability, and drive them to these desperate measures to the point where they kill each other and die, that disconnect for human life, it has to be placed in front of them. It has to be personalized. It has to be politicized.
So, all right, thank you so much. This is the last question that we have, and it's from the audience. And I think just to tie it back to the way that we started this like really rich conversation, and thank you all so much for plugging in and joining us. That the Bernie campaign and electoral campaigns in general, right, are just tremendous opportunities to speak to mass numbers of people about our ideas and like the things that we were just speaking about right now, and to connect with a huge amount of people who we wouldn't ordinarily be able to connect to. So they offer our movements an opportunity to sort of scale, to talk to lots of people at once about decommodifying housing and evictions being violent and canceling the rent. But it's really incumbent on us to be able to move beyond just the election cycle, right? Because the election cycle is really just the beginning, even if that. And that's going to mean those one-on-one conversations and building tenant unions at the ground level. So the last question that I want to hear from each of you on this is, what advice would you have for someone who's looking to get started organizing their building or starting a tenant union in their neighborhood, but they've never done it before?
Okay, I'll go first, because the thing that immediately comes to mind is a quote from our dear comrade, John Washington. Shout out, John, one of the best organizers I know, and longtime tenant organizer in Buffalo. John said something to me earlier this summer that I was like, holy shit, that's the best advice I've ever heard about organizing in general, but tenant organizing in particular. He said, start small and build at the speed of trust. And I was like, that's it. Like, that is it. Because, I think many of the folks on this call with me share a kind of ambition about numbers and like the scale of power that we need in order to win. And that is totally well and good. And that is part of what power building is. But there's also a depth of relationship that's so necessary when you're organizing, especially tenants who are facing the deepest crises among all of us, right? And trust is so critical, right? When you're going on a rent strike, you need to be able to trust your neighbors. You need to be able to trust your union. You need to be able to trust your comrades across the board to have your back when shit goes sideways, because chances are shit's going sideways. So I think like start small and build at the speed of trust. And that literally could look like two neighbors connecting and going really deep and deciding what they'd want to do and kind of having a vision for like what it will look like for them to live in this building once they build a union, before even like canvassing the building, right? Before even going anywhere. It's about like building maybe one, maybe two really deep relationships, and then using that as the starting point of something much, much bigger and more expansive than any of us. So start small, build at the speed of trust. John Washington, shout out.
To add on to that with the trust, I always say trust the process. We built a lot of momentum really early in KC Tenants. Big wins really fast, which is not normal, right? It might have given people the notion that, oh, this is how this happens. It is a process. Don't always win. Sometimes you lose a lot more than you win, but you got to trust the process. It is a process. And so what you have to do is just trust the person that you're standing next to as they trust the person standing next to them, because organizing is relational. And as long as you have that foundation and you trust the process, when you win, you organize. When you lose, you organize.
Yeah, I definitely want to triple add to that. Trust, I mean, it's so important. I was doing this, it brings up the story. I was doing this focus group with a technology group who wanted to, help with organizing. And they were like, if you can put your mind to it, what could technology do? Whatever you want. And I was just like, well, one thing that I know I can't do is build trust. And so you need to remember that. And that's one thing that you cannot replace an organizer with, is technology, because the ability to build trust is only through human connection. And so, yeah, I think trust is right on. And to engage somebody, at least the Bangladeshi way, we'd invite them for some chai and have some biscuits and chat, really, just like make it simple. It doesn't necessarily have to be like come to this action and get all rah it could just be like, come tell us what are your issues, meet some of the other people, get to know them, and then if you feel like, hey, I like these folks, keep coming, right? And then keep seeing what we're doing. You don't necessarily have to jump all in, right? And you can just be an observer if you like. And sometimes, some people just need to sit back and just watch what you're doing and see the power themselves, and honestly, power is literally equal to trust. And that means that, when I say I'm going to show up, I'm going to show up. And literally it just sometimes means that.
That's all really amazing advice. And I think that one thing that I've really been holding recently and thinking about is that winning is like way harder than losing in a lot of respects, right? And as we build off the Bernie campaign and the ways that we were talking about housing all across the country, and our movement to cancel rent grows, and we fight to keep the eviction moratorium moving forward, it's not like you ever can stop organizing. I want to like super underscore what Tiana said. If you win, you organize, and if you lose, you organize. That's what co-governance is, right? That's just an ongoing commitment to building tenants unions and holding people consistently accountable. So I really do want to encourage everyone to get started doing tenant organizing where you live. It's such a amazing and wonderful thing to build connections wherever you are, and it's also really political and powerful, and it's all that we need to do. So thank you everybody for coming out. If you're in New York City, I want to ask you to come out to Housing Court in Manhattan on October 1st at 11 a.m. You'll hear from the Bangladeshi Tenants Union and many other powerful housing groups. Our eviction moratorium is lifting on October 1st, and so we're going to go try and keep our housing courts closed, inspired by the Casey tenants and others across the country. So that's October 1st, 11 a.m. at Foley Square. So if you're in Manhattan, please come out and join us if you're in the New York area. And regardless, if you're in New York or wherever you're plugging in from, I want to remind folks to come back at 5 p.m. for a session with the Afro-Socialist and Socialists of Color Caucus about Black politics, Black Lives Matter, and continuing the political revolution. So that'll be right back here on Facebook. And the information is in the Eventbrite and in the YouTube comments and the Facebook comments below if you want to register for that. And so that's all we have for you. Thank you so much for hopping on, and hope y'all can enjoy the rest of your Saturdays.
Thanks, Sia.
Bye.
Bye.
See y'all later.
Thank you. Love to connect later.